The man you are looking at held the highest military rank of any actor in American history, a Major General of the United States Air Force. To you, he is George Bailey, running through the snow in It's a Wonderful Life, screaming "Merry Christmas" in the happiest moment ever captured on film. But look closer at that face. That is the face of a soldier on the edge of a breakdown, trying desperately to scream away the nightmares of a war that shattered his soul. He wasn't acting, he was surviving. Because for Jimmy Stewart, the truth was far more painful than the script. It wasn't a wonderful life. James Stewart arrived on May 20th, 1908, in the gritty industrial town of Indiana, Pennsylvania. His father, Alex Stewart, didn't just run the local hardware store. He commanded it like a forward operating base. Alex was a man cut from Scottish granite, stern, deeply Presbyterian, and fiercely proud of the tangible reality of steel and wood. He expected his son to be a man of substance, an architect, or an engineer, someone who built things that lasted. He certainly didn't raise a son to paint his face and pretend to be other people. Jimmy was the anomaly in Alex's orderly world. He was a beanpole of a boy, so thin and gangly that he looked like a strong wind might blow him into the next county. He carried a heavy, halting stutter that trapped his words in his throat, making every sentence a struggle. He felt safer in the background, away from the judging eyes. While other boys were tackling each other on the football field, Jimmy retreated to the basement with an accordion. That squeezed, wheezing instrument became his voice. It was clumsy, loud, and decidedly uncool. Exactly what a shy boy needed to occupy space without speaking a single word. He poured his soul into those bellows. The accordion was his shield against a world he didn't quite understand. He tried to follow the script his father wrote. He went to Princeton University. He studied architecture, drawing plans for airport terminal with the precision of a mathematician, a bitter irony, considering he would spend his future bombing the very runways he learned to design. He graduated in 1932, a respectable life laid out before him like a blueprint. Then, in the depths of the Great Depression, he tore the blueprint up. He put his degree in a drawer and joined a theater troupe. It was a quiet rebellion, the first time the dutiful son chose his own path over his father's expectation. New York City brought him to a cramped apartment that smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage, stale beer, and cheap cigarettes. It also brought him Henry Fonda. Hollywood has never seen a pair like this since. They were the original odd couple, living in a squalid room at the Madison Square Hostel. They were broke, starving, and impossibly tall. They survived on a diet of rice and ketchup stolen from diners. They owned one decent suit between them. If Jimmy had an audition, Henry stayed home in his underwear playing solitaire, and vice versa. Yet amidst the crushing poverty of the 1930s, they found moments of pure, unadulterated childhood. On windy afternoon, these two grown men, future legends of the screen, would climb to the roof of their tenement building to fly kites. Two beanpoles running across the tar paper roof, eyes fixed on paper diamonds dancing above the grim New York skyline. It was their way of escaping the hunger gnawing at their bellies. But beneath the brotherhood, a fault line was forming. The 1930s were a political powder keg. Henry Fonda was a fiery New Deal Democrat who believed the system was broken and needed to burn. Jimmy Stewart was a staunch Hoover Republican who believed in tradition, order, and the American way. They argued constantly, their voices echoing off the thin walls of their apartment. Then came the night the dam broke. It was winter. The snow was falling heavy on the streets of New York. They had been at the local tavern, nursing cheap beer, when the conversation turned to politics. Fonda started shouting about unions. Stewart dug his heels in about loyalty. The yelling spilled out onto the icy sidewalk. Words weren't enough anymore. Fonda threw a punch. Stewart threw one back. It wasn't a movie fight. It was messy, ugly, and desperate. Two best friends, freezing in thin coats, sliding on the ice, trading blows until their noses bled and their knuckles bruised. They fought until they were too exhausted to stand. They collapsed into a snowbank, steam rising from their breath into the cold night air. Silence settled over them. In that quiet, looking at the blood on the snow, they realized the terrifying truth. Politics was about to cost them the only family they had in this city. They loved each other more than they hated the other's opinion. Henry looked at Jimmy. Jimmy looked at Henry. They wiped the blood off their faces and made a pact right there on the frozen pavement. They swore they would never discuss politics again. Not one word. And they kept that vow. Through fame, through a world war, through 50 years of history that tore the rest of the country apart, they never broke the treaty of the snowbank. Henry Fonda remained the one man who knew the skinny kid with the accordion before the world turned him into a god. He was the anchor that kept Jimmy tethered to the earth. By 1939, the boy from the hardware store had become the heartbeat of America. Hollywood had plenty of gods. Cary Grant was the sophisticated dream. Clark Gable was the rugged king. But Jimmy Stewart? He was us. He was the guy next door who stumbled over his words when he talked to a pretty girl. He was the moral compass in a cynical world. He didn't act, he behaved. Watch Mr. Smith Goes to Washington again. When he stands on the Senate floor, exhausted, hoarse, fighting a corrupt system with nothing but his conscience, you aren't watching a performance. You are watching the pure, unadulterated decency that Jimmy carried in his bones. That role didn't just make him a star, it made him a symbol of American idealism. Then came 1940 and The Philadelphia Story. This is the film that should be in a time capsule. He stood between two titans, the impossibly debonair Cary Grant and the fierce Katharine Hepburn. In any other hands, the character of Macaulay Connor would have disappeared, but Jimmy stole the movie. He brought a raw, drunk, poetic vulnerability to the screen that beguiled the audience. In February 1941, the Academy called his name. He won the Oscar for Best Actor. But here is where the story gets real. Look at the photos of him that night. He doesn't look triumphant. He looks almost apologetic. Jimmy whispered to his friends that the statue didn't belong to him. He believed with all his heart it belonged to Henry Fonda for The Grapes of Wrath. He felt like an imposter. The next morning, he called his father Alex back in Pennsylvania to share the news. He expected praise. He expected his father to finally understand. Instead, the old man grunted on the line and said, "You'd better send that trophy home, Jim. I'll clear a space for it in the knife case at the store." And that is exactly what happened. The most coveted award in cinema spent 25 years sitting in a dusty hardware store window in Indiana, Pennsylvania, right next to the pocket knives and garden shears. To his father, and eventually to Jimmy, it was just a piece of metal. It wasn't the measure of a man. The real measure of the man was about to be taken. Across the ocean, Europe was burning. Hitler was marching. The draft notice arrived in 1941. At this moment, Jimmy Stewart was earning $12,000 a week, a staggering fortune in those days. The studio executives panicked. They begged him to use his influence to stay home. They told him he was too valuable as a cultural asset to risk his life in a trench. Jimmy ignored them. He was the first major American movie star to wear a military uniform in World War II. But there was a problem, a humiliating one. When he reported for his physical induction, the doctors looked at his gangly frame and shook their heads. He stood 6'3", but weighed only 138 pounds. He was 5 pounds under the Army's minimum weight requirement. The medical officer stamped his paper. Rejected. The great American hero rejected for being too frail. Most men would have taken that rejection as a get-out-of-jail-free card. They would have gone back to their mansions and their martinis. Jimmy went home and declared war on his own metabolism. He refused to accept the rejection. He spent the next few days in a self-imposed boot camp of gluttony. He ate bananas until he choked. He drank gallons of heavy cream and milk until he was sick. He did push-ups until his arms trembled. He forced his body to expand through sheer willpower. He marched back to the recruitment office, sweating and bloated, and stepped on the scale. He had gained exactly enough weight, down to the ounce, to pass. He was sworn in as a private. But the fight wasn't over. The military brass saw Jimmy Stewart, movie star. They wanted to use him as a show pony. They wanted him to sell bonds, not drop bomb. Jimmy was furious. He hadn't eaten all those bananas to be a mascot. He was a licensed pilot with over 400 hours of commercial flying experience before the war even started. He demanded combat. He fought his commanding officers with the same stubbornness he showed in Mr. Smith. He transferred units, trained endlessly, and pushed for a transfer overseas. Finally, he got his wish. In November 1943, Captain James Stewart sat in the cockpit of a B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber nicknamed the Flying Coffin. He wasn't flying a desk. He was flying straight into the flak-filled skies over Germany. The golden boy of Hollywood had left the building. The soldier had arrived. The cameras stopped rolling in 1941. For the next 4 years, the only shooting Jimmy Stewart saw was from the waist gunners of a B-24 Liberator. He commanded the 703rd Bombardment Squadron, flying 20 combat missions deep into Nazi-occupied Europe. If you know anything about the air war, you know the B-24 was a beast. They called it the Flying Coffin for a reason. It was heavy, hard to steer, and caught fire if you looked at it wrong. Jimmy sat in that cockpit, suspended 5 miles above the earth, in freezing temperatures, flying through walls of exploding black flak that could turn a plane into scrap metal in seconds. The worst part wasn't the fear of dying. It was the burden of living. As a squadron commander, Jimmy was responsible for the boys flying on his wing. He had to make the decision: turn left, turn right, drop now. If he guessed wrong, 10 men in a neighboring plane died. And he guessed wrong sometimes. Every commander does. He watched planes under his command, planes filled with 20-year-old kids from Kansas and Ohio, explode in mid-air or spiral into the clouds. He saw the empty bunks in the barracks that night. He wrote letters to their mother. The stress ate him alive. He developed a condition the pilots called flak happy, what we now know as severe PTSD. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold a coffee cup. He couldn't keep food down. He stopped sleeping. By the time he came home in 1945, the boyish charm was dead. He was gray, gaunt, and looked 20 years older than the man who left. He refused to talk to the press. He refused to be a hero. He packed his bags and prepared to quit acting forever. How could he pretend to be upset about a lost wallet or a broken romance when he had seen men burn? Acting felt trivial. It felt fake. Then Frank Capra knocked on his door. Capra was a legend, but he was also a veteran who had served in the Signal Corps. He saw the wreckage in Jimmy's eyes. He didn't offer him a war movie. He offered him a fantasy about a man named George Bailey who wants to kill himself. Jimmy hesitated, but he took the role, and thank God he did, because It's a Wonderful Life isn't a movie, it is an exorcism. Watch the film again with this knowledge. When George Bailey is raging at his family, destroying the models of the bridges he never built, that isn't acting. That is the rage of a man who feels trapped by fate. When he stands on that bridge in the snow, staring into the black water, considering suicide, that isn't a script. That is the darkness Jimmy Stewart brought back from Germany. But the moment that proves it, the moment that breaks your heart, is the prayer in the bar. George sits alone at Martini's, sweaty, desperate, whispering, God, dear Father in heaven, I'm not a praying man, but if you're up there and you can hear me, show me the way. I'm at the end of my rope. Look at his face in that scene. The tears that well up in his eyes, they weren't in the script. Frank Capra didn't ask for them. Jimmy Stewart later admitted that in that moment, he wasn't George Bailey. He was Jimmy Stewart, the exhausted soldier, pleading with God to take away the pain of the war. He was begging for peace. He broke down right there on camera, and Capra, recognizing the sacredness of the moment, didn't yell cut. He zoomed in. That is why 80 years later, that scene still makes you cry. You aren't watching a character. You are watching a real human soul cracking open and letting the light back in. It was the performance that saved his life. For a long time, Hollywood thought Jimmy Stewart would die alone. He was the eternal bachelor, the awkward heartthrob who dated the most beautiful women in the world, Olivia de Havilland, Marlene Dietrich, but never put a ring on their finger. The war had left him scarred, and perhaps he felt too broken to share his life with anyone. Then, in 1949, at a dinner party at Gary Cooper's house, he met Gloria Hattrick McLean. She was everything he wasn't. She was loud, funny, a former model who could drive a golf ball further than most men, and swore like a sailor when she missed a putt. She looked at the shy, stammering movie star and didn't see a legend. She saw a man who needed a good laugh. Jimmy was 41 years old. He had waited half a lifetime to find her. They married weeks later, and for the first time since leaving Indiana, Jimmy Stewart had a home. They settled into a house on North Roxbury Drive. Gloria was the only person on earth who could chase away the nightmares that still woke Jimmy in the middle of the night. When the ghosts of the B-24s came back, she was there to turn on the light. Gloria had 2 young sons from a previous marriage, Ronald and Michael. This is where the character of the man shines brightest. In 1949, stepfathers were often distant figures, not Jimmy. He adopted the boys immediately. He gave them his name. He checked their homework, taught them how to fish, and sat with them when they had the flu. To Ronald and Michael, he wasn't the guy from the movies. He was just Dad, the tall guy who drove a station wagon and wore mismatched socks. They later had twin daughters, Kelly and Judy, completing the picture of the American dream. For 15 years, life was good. The sun shone on Roxbury Drive, but history has a way of repeating itself, and shadows began to lengthen over the Stewart household. The 1960s arrived, the music changed, the culture shifted, and across the Pacific, a new war was brewing in a place called Vietnam. Jimmy was now a brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve. He still flew occasional missions, keeping his skills sharp. He read the intelligence reports. He knew this war wasn't like the one he fought. There were no clear front lines, no defined enemy, just a green jungle that swallowed young men whole. Then the inevitable happened. His eldest son, Ronald, walked into the living room. He was a strapping young man, raised on the stories of his father's generation. He told his father he had enlisted in the United States Marine. A different father, A famous father might have picked up the phone. Jimmy Stewart could have called the Pentagon. He could have pulled strings to get Ronald a desk job in Washington or a safe post in Germany. He had the power to keep his boy safe. But Jimmy Stewart was a man of a different code. He believed in duty. He believed that if the neighbor's son had to go, then his son had to go too. Privilege wasn't a shield, it was a responsibility. He looked at Ronald and saw himself 20 years earlier, eager and naive. But this time, Jimmy wasn't the one going. He was the one staying behind. He felt the unique, cold terror that only a soldier father knows. He knew exactly what a bullet did to a body. He knew exactly what a burning plane smelled like. He shook Ronald's hand. He told him he was proud. But as he watched his son walk out the door in that crisp Marine uniform, the general felt a familiar dread settle in his stomach. He wasn't sending a soldier to war. He was sending his heart into the fire. June 8th, 1969, a Sunday, the day the music stopped forever on North Roxbury Drive. The knock on the door was polite. It always is. Standing on the porch were the officers in their dress blues, faces carved from stone, holding the telegram that every military family prays never arrives. Ronald Stewart, First Lieutenant, United States Marine Corps, was gone. He had been killed in action in the DMZ, Quang Tri Province, Vietnam. He was 24 years old. He died leading his men, just as his father had done over the skies of Germany. But this time, the plane didn't come back. Jimmy Stewart received the news standing up. He was a general. He knew the protocol. He didn't scream. He didn't curse God. He listened to the officers, nodded, and thanked them for coming. He closed the door. Then he walked up the stairs to his bedroom and closed that door too. The silence that descended on that house was heavier than any scream. Jimmy Stewart had spent his life believing in the code of duty, honor, and country. He had lived by it. He had raised his son by it. And now that code had handed him a folded flag in exchange for his boy. The guilt was a living thing. It sat on his chest, crushing him. He knew with terrifying certainty that he could have saved Ronald. One phone call to the Pentagon, one favor called in, he could have kept him safe, but he didn't. He respected his son's choice to serve, and that respect cost him everything. He never spoke publicly about his son's death, not once. It was a wound too deep for words, a grief so private that sharing it felt like a betrayal. The man who played George Bailey, the man who taught us that life is wonderful, now walked through his days with a broken heart that would never mend. For the next 25 years, Gloria was the only thing keeping him alive. She was the steel in his spine. She made him laugh when he wanted to weep, dragged him out to golf, forced him to eat, forced him to keep breathing. She was his anchor in a world that had lost its color. But fate wasn't finished with Jimmy Stewart. In 1994, the doctors found the cancer in Gloria's lung. It was aggressive. Watching the vibrant, loud, unstoppable love of his life fade away was a torture worse than any war. On February 16, 1994, Gloria died. And in that moment, James Maitland Stewart died too. Oh, his heart kept beating. His lungs kept drawing air. But the man was gone. He stood at her grave, an 85-year-old legend, and looked like a lost child. When he went back to the empty house on Roxbury Drive, he didn't just grieve. He shut down. He refused to eat. He refused to see friends. He stopped taking his heart medication. Most heartbreaking of all, he stopped wearing his hearing aid. He told his housekeeper that he had heard everything he ever wanted to hear. Without Gloria's voice, the world was just noise. He became a ghost in his own home. He would sit in the garden for hours, staring at the flowers she had planted, waiting, just waiting. His doctor tried to intervene. He told Jimmy, "You have to eat, Jim. You have to keep going." Jimmy looked up with those tired, sad eyes, the eyes that had seen the horrors of Nazi Germany and the empty bedroom of his son, and asked a question that haunts me to this day. "Why?" he whispered. "Why do I have to stay?" say, I just want to be where she is. It wasn't a wonderful life anymore. It was a waiting room, and he was checking his watch, desperate for the final curtain to fall. The waiting finally ended on July 2nd, 1997, in that quiet bedroom on North Roxbury Drive, surrounded by his children. The old general's breathing slowed. The heart that had survived the flak over Germany, the heart that had broken over Vietnam, beat its final rhythm. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. Just before he slipped away, he looked at his family. He didn't speak of movies. He didn't speak of Oscars. He whispered the only truth that mattered to him in the end. I'm going to be with Gloria now. And then he was gone. The separation was over. We make a mistake when we compare him to George Bailey. George Bailey needed an angel named Clarence to come down from heaven and show him his life was worth living. Jimmy Stewart had no angel. He had no miracle. He faced the horrors of the 20th century, the Great Depression, the World War, the loss of a child, with nothing but his own quiet, granite resolve. He absorbed the blows of fate and refused to let them turn him bitter. He stood tall when he wanted to collapse. He smiled for us when he wanted to scream. That isn't just acting. That is the definition of character. He represented a generation of men who believed that dignity was a silent practice, not a public performance. So, I have a request for you. When the snow falls and you sit down to watch It's a Wonderful Life, look past the black and white flickering screen again. Don't just see the movie star. See the 20-mission bomber pilot. See the father who folded the flag for his son. See the husband who died of a broken heart. When George Bailey runs through the snow screaming, "Merry Christmas!" know that he is running for all the men who didn't come back, and for the parts of himself he left in the sky. Sleep well, General. You've earned your wing. But before I go, let's turn the lights back on for a moment. Jimmy shared the frame with the absolute titans of cinema. He traded barbs with the fiery Katharine Hepburn. He gazed into the eyes of Grace Kelly. He fell for Kim Novak, and he stood toe-to-toe with John Wayne. So, I want to hear from you. In the vast gallery of his film, which co-star do you think brought out the absolute best in Jimmy Stewart? Let me know in the comments below. Subscribe if you want to keep the history of Hollywood alive. Until next time.